You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. In long-term relationships and marriages, sexual frequency and satisfaction tend to decline over time. In fact, in a national survey we conducted last year at the Kinsey Institute, we found that only about 28% of adults in long-term committed relationships reported that they were very satisfied with their current sex life. Most people seem to think that it could be better. So what can you do if you and your partner don't really seem to be in sync anymore when it comes to sex? That's what we're going to be talking about in today's show. We're going to explore how to reset and respark your sexual connection. Some of the topics we'll address include the benefits of sensate focus exercises, which aim to increase touch, intimacy, and communication. We'll also dive into the topic of sexual initiation, including why initiation attempts sometimes turn our partners off instead of on, and how we can learn to initiate in ways that are actually going to stimulate desire in our partners. We'll also talk about the importance of expanding our definition of sex and bringing more creativity and imagination into the bedroom. I am joined once again by Dr. Rebecca Howard-Udy, an AASECT certified sex therapist who helps couples navigate sex, desire, and connection, especially when life and kids make it feel impossible. Certified in emotionally focused therapy, she specializes in the ever-changing dynamics of relationships, especially in the whirlwind of parenting. This is going to be another fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Are you passionate about building a career in sexuality? Look no further than the Sexual Health Alliance. With SHA, you'll connect with world-class experts and join an engaged community of sexuality professionals from all around the world. Whether you're just beginning your journey or are in the process of building advanced skills, SHA's comprehensive certifications, engaging events, and self-paced online training will move you beyond the basics and set you up to be a rising star in the field. Visit sexualhealthalliance.com and start building the sexuality career of your dreams today. Okay, Rebecca, let's talk about how to reconnect sexually with a partner. So in a lot of long-term relationships, the sexual connection fades over time. And before you know it, you're more like roommates than lovers, and you realize that it's been months or maybe even years since you've had sex. Or maybe you do still have sex on occasion, but it just feels like you're going through the motions and no one is really getting what they want out of it. Sex can become something that's more like a chore, something that you think you're supposed to do instead of something that you really want to do. And in situations like this, sex therapists often give a counterintuitive piece of advice, which is to say, let's temporarily take sex off of the table for a while and focus on connecting in other ways. And one of the most commonly recommended ways to do this is to explore what's called sensate focus. So tell us a little bit about how this works in practice. What is sensate focus and how can it be a beneficial practice for partners or spouses who are just no longer sexually in sync?
Yeah. This advice does sound counterintuitive, but what it does is it actually takes the pressure off. Because when sex and pressure get mixed up together, whether it's in the instance of a desire discrepancy or whether it's like a performance-related issue, like something like erectile dysfunction or, difficulty orgasming, taking the pressure off really lets partners lean into what is pleasurable and rediscover together what's pleasurable. So one of the things that often happens in long-term relationships is that the sex ends up getting very routine. And, there's nothing wrong with that. Often that ends up being very pleasurable. Couples kind of whittle it down to the things that they do together that are the most mutually pleasurable. It's sort of like the biggest bang for your buck. But when that's all there is and there's not exploration, or whether that's more pleasurable for one partner than it is for the other, it can really dampen the desire to be sexual together at all. And so taking those activities off the table. And so when you say, you're going to take sex off the table for the time being and do a sensate focus, it doesn't mean that we're not asking people to be sexual together in other ways. So what that means is all of that way that you typically have sex, whether that's penetrative sex or, whatever that means to the couple having sex, that's off the table. And then that opens the door to do these series of graduated exercises that helps people that are focused on sensation and pleasure and not goal driven in the way that I'm using my finger quotations, sex is goal driven.
Yeah. So sensate focus is one of those ways that sort of gets people to rethink the way that they're approaching intimacy, because the focus is really just on connecting with your partner, being present with them, as opposed to like, let's get down to business and, engage in penetration and these other activities. Now, sensate focus has been around for a long time, since the pioneering days of Masters and Johnson. They developed this technique and they encouraged couples to engage in it as part of like almost every sex therapy program that they developed. And it's reported to have very high success rates, but it doesn't always seem to work. And I've heard some sensate focus horror stories from people who have tried it and it just didn't have the intended effect. So for example, I was reading through a bunch of posts on Reddit before the show, and there was this one from a woman who talked about how her therapist recommended sensate focus, so she and her partner gave it a try. But when she lays down naked, her partner straddles her and she feels like squashed underneath his weight and is physically uncomfortable. And then her partner just touches her in ways that are just kind of like aversive to her. So they stopped, never did it again, never went back to that therapist, and just never spoke about that experience again. There are lots of other stories I was reading where, people were saying that they found sensate focus to be awkward, uncomfortable, or otherwise unpleasant. So I wondered if you had any tips that you could share on how to increase the odds of making sensate focus work for people who found that it just like wasn't cutting it for them. Are they just not approaching it the right way? I think in some cases, the partners are kind of treating it a little bit differently. In some of the stories I was reading, it sounded like one partner was treating it as foreplay, whereas the other was kind of taking the exercise seriously. So I think, sometimes there's just a disconnect in the way partners are approaching it. But what are your thoughts here? How can we make sensate focus work better for people who are finding that it's not cutting it?
Well, I have heard that from couples as well. One of the biggest challenges that I face with getting couples to actually do sensate focus in a way that works is going back to that time thing. So finding the time to actually do it, to actually do the homework. So I actually spend a lot of time with people, getting them to the point where they can carve out the time. There often is a lot of resistance to doing it. And even when there's not initially resistance, sometimes you'll talk with a couple and say, okay, so this is what I want you to do, and this is why. So getting that buy-in is huge in the beginning, like huge. You can't just say, okay, this is sensate focus. Here's a one-pager, go forth, and do this together. It will bring up resistance. 100%. Even when the couple's like, this sounds great. We're both on board. Let's definitely do it. They come back in and one person will have an experience where they're like, I was cold the whole time. And that's all I thought about. And I didn't say anything. And it was terrible and it felt awkward. And so then, okay, so there's some resistance showing itself. Why did you not say something? What was that about? This is a communication exercise. Sure, right. It's a touching exercise. The point of it is to communicate. And so what holds you back from communicating? What were you afraid of? Like, it's such a beautiful opportunity to lean into the resistance, but resistance is uncomfortable. And we don't treat resistance with like, just do it anyway. We got to listen to what it says. And so that's the whole point of the exercise, is to feel the resistance that comes up. But that's uncomfortable for people. And so I think that that's where a lot of people get stuck, is they're like, we did this and it was weird and uncomfortable. And so actually the response is, probably means you're doing it right. Like, that's some resistance. Let's work with that. Let's see if we can, not that I want people to be uncomfortable, but it's not a bad thing to work with that. How do we make that more comfortable? How do we make it more accessible? But I think it is a challenge.
Yeah, it definitely can be. And, as I'm thinking back on all of these stories that I was reading, it sounded like the partners weren't really communicating, like that they were kind of engaged in this activity. Their partner's touching them. It's aversive. They don't like it, but they're not saying anything. And it's like, this is, as you said, supposed to be a communication exercise. Like one of the key parts of sensate focus is that you're supposed to communicate if you don't like the touch, because we want the touch to be pleasurable or at least pleasant. We don't want it to be aversive. So that's where this often seems to go wrong, is that you're not having that communication piece. And then that gets it, a deeper issue in the relationship that you might need to address first, which is how do we work on the communication piece before we get to the point of, we're touching each other physically.
I think it can go either way. So we certainly, and with some couples, depending on how strong that resistance is, we would actually then go into working on the communication, making it feel safe to communicate what you need. If you can't do this outside the bedroom, then it's really difficult to do it in the bedroom, because most people, as you know, communicating what you want in the bedroom is challenging. So if you're not really comfortable doing it outside the bedroom. So there's sometimes that we do this sort of prep work around communicating needs and strengthening communication outside the bedroom. But also that tells me, this way that you're describing, where these partners have these experiences where it's like really unpleasant for them and their partner's touching them in ways that don't feel good to them and they don't say anything. To me, that sounds like really bad sex. And why would you want bad sex? So that tells me something about the desire or the issue, the sexual issue in the relationship that they might be coming in with, and where we need to work. And so when I say that sounds like bad sex, that sounds like a judgment. But really, if it's not pleasurable, if you're not doing things that are pleasurable together, then why would you want to do them?
Yeah. And this also has me thinking about, the importance of doing sensate focus with a really skilled therapist, as your guide in terms of teaching you how to do this. It's one thing to just read about sensate focus online and then try it yourself, but there's a lot more to it than what you're reading in these online guides. And I think too, another part of this where there can sometimes be this disconnection and where partners don't have a pleasurable experience is because we're kind of expecting our partners to be mind readers and to know exactly what kind of touch we like and the amount of pressure that we enjoy and what is pleasant to us. And so when we're just expecting our partners to know our bodies better than we know our own bodies, that's one of the problems here, is that sometimes we need to understand ourselves first. What kind of touch do I like and what kind of touch don't I like? And that might involve some self-exploration on your own to figure out what are the sensations and things that you enjoy so that you can actually communicate about that to your partner. Because if you don't know what it is that you like, how can you tell your partner what it is that you like? And we'll come back to that issue more a little bit later, because I think, there's a lot to be said for owning your own desires. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about sexual initiation, because I think that's another big part of sexually reconnecting. You need to initiate sex in a way that's actually going to stoke your partner's desire instead of turning them off. And as it turns out, the way that some people initiate sex just isn't having the intended effect. So for example, you share a story in the book about a friend of yours who said that her husband's go-to move for initiating sex is to just like walk up to her wherever she is, in the kitchen or anywhere in the house, and poke her with his erection. But the poke just isn't doing it for her. She wants a little romance. She wants to feel desired. So as a sex therapist, how often do you see situations like this where one partner's initiation attempts just aren't working and they're turning the other person off instead of on?
So often. So often. And also, I so feel for the person who's holding the initiation in the relationship, because every time that person takes a risk to initiate and then feels rejected, it gets harder and harder to do it the next time. And so what I so often see in a relationship is that one partner is holding all of the initiation and the other partner isn't. And they may be holding different initiation. They'd be doing a lot of conversations about emotions or something like that. Also very important. But this goes back again to the communication. So the erection poke, that may work really well for some couples. Someone may be listening to this and be like, well, actually, I love it when my partner does that. That so works for me. Great. Okay. But the thing that often happens is that when a partner is initiating something, they're initiating sex, right? So coming up and initiating a kiss or a hug or a touch, when done in a way that the partner is receptive to, is not likely to be rejected. But that's complicated because you need to know what your partner, how they like to be touched. So for instance, if your partner is a deep pressure person and you're coming up and giving them like little like butterfly fingers, that's not going to feel good in their body. So being aware of what feels good in your partner's body, and then also being really aware of what it is that you're initiating. So one of the things that often happens in long-term relationships is that the casual physical touch goes way down. The affectionate touch goes way down. Because if every affectionate touch or every kiss or every hug is seen as an opening to have sex, then the lower desire partner is not going to want to engage in that anymore. And they're going to start to have this like, flinch reaction every time their partner comes towards them. The real thing that needs to happen there is a rebalancing of initiation. So saying to your partner something like, I really like to kiss you. And also, it doesn't mean that I want to have sex right now. So being clear about what you are open to or what your initiation is can really help.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And I think it's also really important for us to understand how our partners even experience desire. Like sometimes you have people in a relationship where one person is more the spontaneous type, the desire just kind of hits them out of the blue, and the other partner is more the responsive type, and they kind of need to feel something first before desire sets in. And the stereotypical gendered pattern would be that, for men in heterosexual relationships, they tend to experience more of the spontaneous type and women experience more of the responsive type, but it can really go in any direction, right? It's not the case that everybody of a certain gender experiences desire in the same way. And so you really need to understand, how does your partner experience desire so that you can initiate sex in ways that are going to work for them. And that might involve changing your typical approach to initiation. And, a lot of people, when they think about sexual initiation, they think it has to mean like, we're going to have sex right now. And, that's something that just doesn't always work. Sometimes one partner needs time to warm up to it. And so maybe you're initiating early in the evening, early in the day, maybe it's earlier in the week. Initiation can be this thing that you kind of slow play. And, that works for some people. To see initiation as this thing that you sort of build up to over time, as opposed to the, immediacy of like, I'm poking you with my erection. Do you want to do this right now or not? For some people, that just doesn't work for them in terms of the way they experience desire. Soaking Wet from BB Health is the world's first probiotic specifically designed for vaginal and vulvar wellness. It's a doctor-formulated blend of 2 prebiotics and 3 probiotics that promote total vaginal health, as well as 3 vitamins and minerals that promote vaginal wetness and overall sexual health. VB Health is on a mission to create supplements that actually work using scientifically backed ingredients. They take quality seriously, with each batch produced tested by 2 separate third-party laboratories for safety and effectiveness. They even share their third-party lab results publicly, which few other companies do. VB Health is a physician-owned and woman-owned business that has happy customers across all 50 states and in over 45 countries. Make every encounter slipperier, sexier, and downright sensational. It's time to get soaking wet and keep those good times coming, literally. And the best part? Soaking Wet is formulated by doctors at VB Health. Visit soakingwet.com and use code JUSTIN for 10% off, or click the link in the show notes.
Even for the spontaneous desire, which is sort of often held up as what desire is, most people will point to the beginning of a relationship where they felt more of the spontaneous desire. Mm-hmm. But even then, there was often a buildup. You plan a date or you plan your outfit. There's a lot of anticipation around coming together in the beginning of a relationship that builds that desire, that's actually stoking the responsive desire. So then by the time you get into the sexual situation, you may feel like it's spontaneous, like you're ready to go all of a sudden. But asking our overtaxed nervous systems and partners who may have more of that responsive desire to just immediately shift gears is not always realistic. And so building that in, I love those examples that you give of like maybe initiating earlier in the day or earlier in the week, or asking, what do you need? What if our goal together is to be sexual in, 45 minutes? What do you need? I guarantee probably what that person doesn't need is to put the kids to bed and deal with screaming children. That is probably not going to be good foreplay. So being really open in the communication about what it is that is enabling to showing up and being willing to see what happens can really help a lot.
Yeah. And I think the way you said it about sort of the gear switching, right? I think that that's really at the heart of the issue for a lot of people, is that they can't just turn on desire like that, and it's, what do you need in order to feel desire? And that can be a hard thing for people to know. And it gets back to what I alluded to earlier, where we also need to own our own desire. We can't say that sexual initiation is just sort of this one-way thing. It's a two-way street. Our partners need to initiate sex in ways that work for us, but we have to know what it is that works for us and communicate about that with our partners. So talk to us a little bit about that. How can we learn to own our own desires and figure out what it is that we really need or want when it comes to turning ourselves on?
Well, this may come really easily to some people. This may be a question that they're very easily able to answer. Those probably are not as likely to be people who show up in my office. They may have already noticed and communicated what it is that they want and been clear about what helps them to access that desire. So very often when I see a couple with a desire discrepancy, the lower desire partner really doesn't know what they want at all. They may actually be coming in and saying, I don't want anything. If I didn't have sex again for the rest of my life, I wouldn't miss it. And so going back to this idea of, if you don't know what you want outside of the bedroom, if you're not expressing desires outside of the bedroom, it's really difficult to do it in the bedroom. So that's the first place I look is, okay, so what do you desire? And what that might be, for a overtaxed parent, they may desire a weekend in a hotel with room service by themselves. Like, great. That's a good place to start.
That sounds nice.
Doesn't it sound nice? Yeah. Truly, that could be a fantasy of somebody. Like, I just want to be left alone, So starting really in an unintimidating way, because going in and saying, okay, what do you want? Tell your partner what's going to bring you sexual satisfaction can be so overwhelming for people. And so I try to go into it gently. And so if someone does not know what they want, I will talk to them about what they don't want, because that's often way easier to access. But that is also desire. So if I don't want my partner to initiate in a certain way, if I don't want to have sex after a long day, what is it that I don't want about that? And then once you sort of narrow in on that, then you can start to break down, well, what would make that more accessible? That's a really good place to start in terms of owning your own desire. But the other piece about that that's really important is, in addition to getting sort of a idea about what the person does desire, and often I will give them some homework, whether it's like a sensate focus, guided masturbation protocol, solo, if it's really hard to access what their body feels like. And this is not uncommon, especially after childbirth or where someone's just really like their body's changed a lot or they're not, really in tune. The other thing that I often do is I'll often like assign erotic fiction or like even just like a steamy beach read to see kind of like, oh, what is attractive to you? What sort of sparks desire? And sometimes I do this in a couple session, and sometimes I sort of split the couple and do it individually, depending on how their communication is. And so that's that, like building that erotic toolkit, so to speak. Like, what is it that you want and how do you communicate about it? But before we even go there, we also need to assess what's actually happening in the relationship. So if there's a ton of pressure, that's going to kill desire. If the sex is not pleasurable, that's going to kill desire. If the life is so busy that there's no time and the nervous system is totally overwhelmed, that's going to kill desire as well. So I have found that doing that work of trying to increase the desire doesn't work very well unless you can get a handle on the things. There's this research about like these two different systems. Emily Nagoski in her book sort of popularized this, the brakes and the accelerator. If you have the e-brake on, anything that you do to kind of own or increase desire is really working at cross purposes. So assessing those things first can be really helpful.
Yeah. I mean, as you were talking about this, I was thinking about how sex therapists really kind of have to be detectives in a lot of way. And you have to ask a lot of questions. And sometimes you need to ask the question in a lot of different ways to really kind of get at the core or the heart of it. I'm thinking about, for example, the question of sexual fantasies and how sometimes a therapist will ask a client, well, what are your fantasies? And they'll say, well, I don't have fantasies. But if you ask about the question in a different way and say, okay, so what do you think about when you touch yourself or pleasure yourself? Or what are you thinking about when you have sex? Then you often find, oh, actually, they do have fantasies. They just weren't counting these things as fantasies, right? Because they thought it needed to take place in outer space or have some fantastical element to it, right? So it's an interesting job, I think, in many ways, being a therapist, because you have to do that detective work to really ask the right questions and help people to really hone in on what is it that really turns you on and what do you want? And yeah, it's sometimes harder than you might think to kind of get that conversation started.
It's so true. It's absolutely true.
Now, another really important thing for our partners who want to reconnect sexually is to change up their definition of sex and recognize that sex doesn't have to be just one thing. So talk to us a little bit about the importance of expanding our definition of sex and why it's important to be imaginative and creative in the bedroom to keep the spark alive.
So this is huge. One of the things that I often encourage couples when we're working together to think about is like even talking about sex, we can count that as sex. Like really expanding really big about what the definition of sex is. Because what that does is it gives you more choices. So somebody may be open on one day to talking about sex or talking about fantasy that they have. But the difference between talking about a fantasy or talking about sex and actually having sex or playing out the fantasy is really huge. And so we need to recognize that in order to have desire, it needs to be safe to stop at any point. And I don't mean safe as in like physically unsafe, because most people are not in that kind of a situation. But like if you're going to deal with a sulky partner or relationship consequences, it doesn't really feel safe to say, I would like to touch each other's bodies, but I don't want to have penetrative intercourse today. That if that's not safe, then that limits what you can do together. Mm-hmm. And so, I do think that it's really important to expand what it is to have sex. And I often use the term being sexual as opposed to having sex, because having sex means something particular to an individual couple and often sort of goes into that routine, which then, as we've talked about, can hold the pressure, the performance, the anxiety. I mean, being a sex therapist, it's essentially shame and anxiety work. And so anything that we can do to sort of short circuit and get around those shame and anxiety pieces is huge. Sometimes we have to address them head on, but other times we do have shortcuts where we can just say, let's just expand what sex is.
Yeah. And it's such an important thing to expand the definition of sex. Like we see this repeatedly demonstrated in the literature that people who have more expansive views of sex, especially as they get older, tend to have more satisfying sex lives, whereas people who tend to have these very narrow definitions and they retain those narrow definitions with age, well, as you age, you tend to encounter more sexual difficulties and the old ways often don't work as well anymore. And so it makes it harder to achieve sexual satisfaction when you're so limited in terms of what sex means to you, when sex is something that can mean any number of different things. Like there are all kinds of ways to be sexual, to be intimate with a partner, to have your needs met or fulfilled, to have an orgasm and so forth. And so, yeah, having that creativity just puts more options on the menu and can be especially important when it comes to something like sex and aging for helping you to have a more dynamic, active, and fulfilling sex life over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't tell you how many couples I see, especially around conception and pregnancy and direct postpartum where they say, well, we can't have sex. Their doctor has told them you can't have penetrative intercourse for whatever medical reason. And they say, well, we can't have sex. We haven't had sex in, 6 months or a year and we need your help. And I'm always so curious about this, without shaming, because this is something that a lot of us have this lens. But to say that you can't have intercourse, for a couple to interpret that as meaning we can't have sex, they haven't touched each other in a year. Like, if you can't have intercourse, you're not going to do anything. And I think that the folks this most often happens to is heterosexual couples. But the ironic thing is that the research tells us that most women are not orgasming through penetrative sex. 95% of women need clitoral stimulation in order to orgasm. And so, there's this disconnect between the real emphasis on penetration and the reality of what makes a pleasurable sexual experience.
Yeah, you're so right. And it is unfortunate the way that some people really have that restrictive view where, especially during that period of following conception, if somebody feels like they can't be intimate at all with their partner for the next 9 months, like that's a heavy burden, to sort of carry around and to put on the relationship, because there are all other kinds of things that you can do together where you can still experience pleasure and be connected. So yeah, lots of reasons why it's important to expand that definition of sex. So thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Rebecca. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about your work and get a copy of your new book?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is available anywhere books are sold. And if people want to find me, they can do that on my website. It's Rebecca Udy. The last name is E as in Edward, UDY.com.
And the book is titled again?
It's called Parents in Love, A Guide to Great Sex After Kids.
And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.